So here's where I'm going to go tonight. And I should just back up and point out I've slightly altered the talk. I'm not a history professor, so it was kind of audacious of me, to say the least, to be offering a history talk to you. I'm a philosophy professor, and so I parenthetically have added here. This will be a short history and philosophy of the sexes. We're going to start with a little bit of the philosophy, then move on to the history to try to show that there really is an interesting philosophical problem here. In the first part of the talk, then, we're going to be looking at the philosophical background to the questions that I'm going to be asking. And that's going to mean we had to talk a little bit about nominalism and realism, this funny debate that occurred in the Middle Ages and still has some resonance in philosophy today, and turns out to have particular resonance to the question of how many human sexes there are. Then we're going to move on to the really fun stuff, which is the short history of the sexes, some of the different views that have been held about just how many sexes there might be. I'm roaming through this history not because I actually think that historical views prove what's really the fact of the matter, but because I want to examine at least what it's possible for us to think, because we at least don't want to be limited in our conception of these things because we wrongly consider some ideas impossible, when in fact there's lots of instances to show that they're possible. And then I will probably run out of time and have to skip most of my conclusion, but I'm going to try to avoid that and actually get to the conclusion, which will be no kind of conclusion at all, but will suggest some avenues we might take. Okay. The whole project here is in a way motivated by a question that the French philosopher Simone de Beauvoir asked in her groundbreaking book, The Second Sex. She began her book, or within the first page, by asking, are there women really? Which seems like an absurd kind of question. She certainly wasn't thinking about the biological question I'm going to be asking tonight, but what she was really interested in was the fact that the word woman and declarations about women so often takes what philosophers call a normative term. Okay, so in philosophy, we talk about how you can use terms descriptively, and that's just to state what the fact of the matter is, or you can use them normatively in order to say how things ought to be, right? And it seemed at least uncontroversial at the time that there are descriptively women. You know, there are these human beings with certain anatomical configurations. That seemed to be uncontroversial, but what worried her was that people would say things like, be more of a woman. She's not enough of a woman. Oh, she's very womanly. And they'd say this in a praiseworthy way. And it worried her that this category of woman, which should be neutral and descriptive, turns out to be a kind of normative category in this way that carries a whole bunch of judgments with it. Over the course of her discussion, she ultimately ended up arguing that women exist only normatively in some sense. And again, she's not making the biological argument here, but that the word woman is really just used to identify this other in society that doesn't hold power and that's seen as some kind of exception to the rule. Right? Her solution to this was to educate boys and girls the very same way from early on, so that there would be no others based on sex anymore. So the hope would be to efface any sort of constructed difference between men and women by educating boys and girls in the same way. So I'm going to be taking some direction from that question, but what's interesting to me, as you'll find out because I repeat it a lot and I even italicize it a lot, is this word really that we get in Beauvoir's question. Okay, so I'm going to be asking some similar questions. Are there men and women really? Are there males and females really? You can tell I just can't believe that these slides actually advance. It's like I've just come out of a time capsule from the 17th century. How many sexes are there really? So what's all this really business? Why am I so interested in it? I'm interested in it because the particular kind of philosophy I do, and here it comes, is a subdiscipline known as metaphysics. Metaphysics is, you can look at the definition up there, but basically metaphysics is the branch of philosophy that's concerned with what reality is actually like. Among other things, metaphysicians try to produce ontologies. An ontology is just the fancy word for an inventory of everything that exists. it's clearly a very big inventory, and no insurance company has been willing to process it yet, and we're not done with it yet. But this is the kind of concern that I want to bring to tonight's talk, is within our ontology, right, how many sexes really exist? But then we have to talk a little bit about this word real, okay? I'm just taking some Oxford English Dictionary definitions here. So real is taken in this sense to be something having an objective existence, actually existing as a thing. Right? Notice that sometimes we use the word real idiomatically, or use the word really idiomatically just as to emphasize what we've just said. In metaphysics, when we talk about something as being real, we want to know whether it actually exists as a thing. We're not just being emphatic about it. And in fact, we want to know in particular whether it actually exists or whether it's merely a figment of thought or language. Right? Which brings us to this medieval debate. And I should mention, by the way, that the word real is a fairly contemporary one. In fact, the Latin use of it only really occurs in the late Middle Ages. Over the course of this debate that I'm about to tell you about, it turns out, if you look at the ancient Latin root of the word res, it just means thing or matter. We only start talking about, what really exists in this way in the Middle Ages. So on the one side of this medieval debate, we have people like, St. Thomas Aquinas here, who take the realist stance, which is just the view that universal or general terms have independent existence outside of our minds. Okay, let me repeat that because it's kind of odd, right? The view that universal or general terms, so for instance, cat, right, or horse, or this gets a little bit more difficult, goodness, right, have some kind of independent existence, even if nobody were to ever think about them, right? Not just when people briefly stop thinking about them now, but if nobody had ever thought about the category of cat, does the category cat still exist somehow? Is there something that binds individual cats together? Okay. Aquinas said yes. On the other side, we have nominalism. And there were a bunch of nominalists, but I'm going to show you a picture of Occam, William of Occam. And the nominalists roughly argued that universal or general terms, in fact, wouldn't exist if we weren't thinking about them. If we'd never thought about cat, there would be no category cat that exists out there in the universe. And that, in fact, words like cat, these general terms, really are just names that we use for things. They're just names. They don't have any existence outside of our minds. So I guess I've already made the point with the cat, but at some point earlier today I thought it was really important to show you a whole bunch of individual horses. And to show that the realist view is that there is some category. I took all the colors and stuff away to try to make the category of horseness itself kind of more abstract. But there's some one overarching general term or category that all of these individuals really partake of, right? And that explains what these three things have in common. So you get people like Plato, this is, in ancient times, arguing that we wouldn't even be able to think about these two things together if they didn't have something in common quite apart from our minds that we could use to connect them, right? On the other hand, we get Aristotle, his student, but not necessarily a very dutiful student in this respect, saying, well, hey, Plato, if these two guys need this horse to explain what they have in common, then doesn't this horse and this ideal horse, don't they need some other horse to explain what they have in common? So in a way, that nasty debate with the disloyal student and his master presaged the much more technical debate that would happen in the 13th and 14th century. Now, most of us are inclined to worry a little bit about saying that the really abstract kinds of universals, like, goodness or justice or whatever, actually have any kind of existence apart from our minds. Most of us do, though, think that there really is some true category horse that these guys all have in common, and that cats really have cat somehow in common, which raises the view that whether you're a nominalist or a realist, some universals are more plausible than others. And by way of example, I'm going to give you a little quote. It's terrible. I'm quoting Foucault, quoting Borges, a great novelist and short story writer. And Borges is quoting an encyclopedia that doesn't exist. That's why I put the scare quotes around it. Borges writes about a certain Chinese encyclopedia, which is just a fiction, that divides animals according to the following taxonomy. So all animals get divided into those belonging to the emperor, embalmed, tame, sucking pigs, sirens, fabulous. I love fabulous in there. It sounds very glam, you know. Stray dogs, included in the present classification, which for a 20th century analytic philosopher is dear to our hearts. I'll tell you over a beer sometime why that's funny. Oh, gosh, what's happened here? Right click. Left click. Next. Thank you. Okay, carrying on the list. Frenzied, innumerable, drawn with a very fine camel hair brush, etc. My second favorite in the list. Having just broken the water picture, and that from a long way off look like flies. He proposes dividing the whole animal world into these categories. I tried really hard. I spent a ridiculous amount of time on Google trying to find an animal that had just broken a water pitcher, and it cannot be found. So I found you a herd of ungulates that from a long way off look kind of like flies. So hopefully next time I'll have a water pitcher for you. So Foucault, quoting this passage, and he quotes it in its entirety, he then comments and says, the thing that we apprehend in one great leap when we read this passage is the stark impossibility of thinking that. Right? You read the taxonomy, and you may not be able to diagnose what's wrong with it, but you just kind of go, no, that can't be right. Right? But he carries on. And asks, but what is impossible to think? And what kind of impossibility are we faced with here? Well, we're not going to go into the animals from the certain Chinese encyclopedia, or I'm certainly not going to get to my conclusion. But I want to motivate the whole discussion tonight by exploring what kind of impossibility is engendered by asking whether there are more or fewer than two sexes. Right? So with all of that philosophical background out of the way, I'll ask once again, this time with italics, how many sexes are there really? Right? Is there some taxonomy out there, other than the one that we're using, that is possible to think in a way that the taxonomy of animals from Borges maybe isn't impossible to think, but maybe it's not so different from that. We'll see as we go along. I want to be clear that tonight I'm talking about sex, not gender, but I want to offer some apologies for that because it's really tough to say how I could have any principled grounds for distinguishing between sex and gender. Those who are working in gender issues know how seriously entangled these two concepts are. It's not clear to me that they can be pulled apart or that they should be pulled apart. And there's lots of debate about which term you should use for what. So I'm just going to sort of declare by fiat how I'm using the terms tonight and apologize for, again, using a hatchet where a scalpel will do. So by sex, I'm just concerned with the biological classification. So I'm not asking here whether there are a bunch of genders, whether there are masculine men and feminine men and sort of gender-neutral men, and that's not my question. I'm not asking about sexual orientation. I'm asking about the biological taxonomy that we use for human sexes, right? So some of the things that might be relevant in such a taxonomy are going to be hormones, chromosomes, anatomy, and in anatomy we might be thinking about primary sexual characteristics like vaginas and penises. But we might also be thinking about sexual characteristics like beards and breasts and things. Those tend to be the sorts of things that we use to categorize people biologically based on sex. For the purposes just of tonight's discussion, I wanted to say that gender is social, psychological, behavioral, that kind of soft stuff, but we do need scare quotes there, and it's way more complicated than I'm letting on. Okay? So with that definition, what we mean by sex tonight, with apologies to Foucault, is it impossible to think anything other than two sexes? Right? Well, it's certainly not impossible to come up with a sentence, right? But it does seem to defy all of our instincts. However, it happens in the natural world. So, for instance, we have here a lovely mushroom called the Schizophyllum commune, which has apparently more than 28,000 mating types. And you see how successful it is, right? They really know how to get it on, these mushrooms, right? Also, there's one species of harvester ant that has 3 mating types. Now, I should stop here and explain these scare quotes around mating types. They are actually quotes because I'm quoting a text, but they're scare quotes too, because it turns out that biologists debate amongst themselves whether a mating type is the same thing as a sex. Now, somebody who is really open-minded about these things might argue that the reason that some biologists will say, well, these ants have 3 mating types, but only 2 sexes, the reason they make that distinction is because they can't get their head around any number other than 2 when it comes to sexual division. And certainly that criticism is out there in the literature. On the other hand, there are biologists who offer principled grounds for distinguishing between mating types and sexes. Here's what we mean by mating types, though. With this particular species of ant, if you don't have 3 distinct types of ant, right, then the colony will die, right? Because the queen reproduces worker ants asexually, right? Geez, and I'm going to get my ants all confused. And then there are 2 males, 2 different types of males she has to mate with to produce the remaining 2 kinds of ants. Oh, to produce either another queen, right, or produce female ants, right? And if she doesn't reproduce another queen at some point, then the whole colony dies out. So the reproductive success of this community hinges upon the necessity of 3 distinct biological types. Now, there are, again, biologists who still want to say that these 2 types of male ants really are just 2 types of male ant because they're anatomically similar and they engage in the same kind of act with the queen. On the other hand, there are biologists who say, no, no, no. If you need these 2 different physical types in order to keep your population going, then you don't get to count them as the very same sex. So that's an issue, that's a debate within biology and philosophy of biology right now. Here's a little bit more disgusting but less controversial one. The pseudobiceros flatworms are all hermaphrodites. They look really cute, right? They look like little walruses. In fact, these are their 2 giant penises. They each have 2 giant penises. And they're all built like this, right? They all have these really big, aggressive penises. And how they mate, they engage in these kinds of wrestling matches and try to impale each other, right, and inject sperm into each other. And that determines who's going to produce the offspring, right? Now, again, some biologists are inclined to say, well, there really are 2 sexes of these flatworms, but every single individual has both of them. For other biologists and philosophers of biology, this stretches credulity a little bit to say that everybody is anatomically the same and engages in the very same sex acts, but we want to say there are 2 sexes still in this species. And then there's this guy. I don't know where he lives. If you know him, I apologize. This is obviously a photo he took with a webcam. A guy named Alex Gross. He put on the internet, though, so it's fair game. He's a playwright and translator, and I have wryly called him here an amateur sexologist because a little bit of Googling reveals that he has a little essay. I say essay advisedly, arguing that there are 22 human sexes. I would have brought some of it in, but it's a little bit on the pornographic side. It has a great deal to do with conduct during mating. Now, I'm not suggesting that we just immediately give over to this guy and say, okay, what the hell, there are 22 sexes, we're all just crazy flatworms, right? the only point I want to make is that others have found it at least conceivable that there is something other than two sexes out there. Still, though, it's really hard to resist the two-sex view. And I put this up here to notice that in electrical components and plumbing, they even describe the parts as male and female, right? There does seem to be this fundamental distinction that we want to see everywhere. We're not just going to impose it on flatworms and on ants. We're going to impose it on plumbing fixtures and so forth, right? This male-female thing. In fact, a feminist thinker from days of yore, you can tell by her hair, Shula Smith Firestone, argues that every kind of dualism we have, every one of these binary distinctions that we are constantly drawing, good, evil, the oppressor and the oppressed. She especially talks about that because she's a Marxist. All of these distinctions, she says, ultimately come down to this fundamental biological distinction. So it's not just that we tend to see things in black and white and therefore we fit male and female into these black and white categories. She says it's because of male and female that we tend to see things in black and white. Right? But despite the almost irresistible nature of the two-sex model, various people at various times have found it possible to think not only the two-sex model, but 1, 3, and 5-sex models. With apologies to the two-sex model, I'm not going to explain it to you tonight because I take it that none of us need to be converted to that one. We were all raised on it. I'm just going to give you a little bit of a tour through the 1, 3, and 5-sex models. And there might even be more models available to us, the 22-sex model or some others that I find more sympathetic than the 22-sex model. So here we go through the history. Okay, the one-sex model. The one-sex model was really brought to our attention in the mid-90s by a guy named Thomas Laqueur, who wrote this fantastic book, Making Sex, about the history of medicine and the different attitudes towards the sexes in medicine and medical textbooks throughout history. Laqueur argues that up until about 1700, there was really something he called a one-sex model in which the female was taken to be simply a kind of underdeveloped male, a sort of special case to the male norm. But according to Laqueur, in 1700, a whole bunch of other changes in the world, not exactly 1700, it's not like the calendar flipped and everybody changed their minds, but around about 1700 you start to see changes in the medical literature and it starts to look much more like males and females are being treated as radically heterogeneous, as quite unlike each other. Right? Perhaps the most famous instance, and certainly the one that gets abused the most, so I'll join in the crowd abusing it, of the one-sex model is from Aristotle's Generation of Animals. Aristotle, in the Generation of Animals, writes about the female, and female humans in particular, as deficient males, right? He writes that the deficient development of her body compared with a man's is obvious. Now, Aristotle had a principled reason for wanting to make this case. He wasn't just being a jerk. And it concerned this notion that he had of essence, the necessity of parents passing their essence onto their children. And he had a big puzzle with how it is that a person's essence, the thing that makes them who they are, sometimes seems to come out in the next generation, and sometimes it doesn't. He also had, this was a biological work, some big questions about how reproduction occurs. On Aristotle's view, the way reproduction occurs, it's kind of gross, we'll go through it quickly, is that men and women use their body heat to try to process blood into sperm. However, argued Aristotle, men have hotter bodies than women do, and they're the only ones who have enough heat to create the sperm. Women only ever create blood, right? Now, he did point out some instances of various creatures who generate too much heat, and then they can't produce sperm. It has to be just the right amount. And this is classically Aristotelian. He's the guy who's famous for, the golden mean, avoiding too much or too little, finding the sweet spot right in the middle, and he thought that he had done that in his theory of how human beings and animals in general reproduce. So on his view, the male and the female mate and exchange fluids. And what occurs is a kind of wrestling match, much like the flatworms, where the male and female fluids go to battle against each other. And if the male fluid has been well enough concocted, it always perseveres over the female fluid. Right? So when a man produces a son and a son who resembles him, it means he's got just the right amount of heat. He's concocted the perfect sperm to reproduce his type perfectly. Right? But if he produces either a female, right, or somebody who doesn't look like him, or, and this is really important to note, a monster, right, we use the same explanation for all three. Right? He hasn't concocted the sperm well enough, and perhaps his mate has concocted her fluid too well, so he doesn't persevere in this big mating battle that occurs between the male and female fluids. Again, I kid you not, in the very next section of the generation of animals, he's got one section where he talks about why it is that females are born. He thought this was, worthy of explanation. How could there be females? It's crazy. And in the very next section, he says, now we're going to use the very same reasoning to figure out how monsters are born. Now, by a monster, he just means, a baby born with birth defects. And the usual idea of a monster is kind of a chimera, a baby that combines different species. So, the donkey-headed boy or whatever. It's produced in the same way that a female is. Yes. We're all deficient. Those of you who are neither females nor donkey-headed boys, I exclude from the we there, are all deficient males. Right? We get something similar happening in Thomas Aquinas. Here he is again. This is the last time I'll mention Aquinas tonight. In his Summa Theologica, Aquinas considers and takes really seriously the question of whether women will rise as men at the resurrection. And here's a direct quote from Aquinas. He says, since all error will be removed at the resurrection. Now, the female sex is produced beside the intention of nature, so it's not the purpose of nature to produce the female sex. It's always an accident, right? Because your sperm's not hot enough or something. Through a fault in the formative power of the seed, which is unable to bring the matter of the fetus to the male form, wherefore the philosopher says, by the philosopher he means Aristotle, which is why Aristotle says that the female is a misbegotten male. Now, I guess Aquinas was sort of a proto-feminist. I say this jokingly because he so wasn't. Because he actually goes on and says, no, they're actually going to rise as women, but there's going to be this kind of miracle where women are no longer imperfect in the afterlife. So, woohoo! So cause for optimism there. Here's some of the Lacour stuff in terms of the medical one-sex model. So, again, Lacour's book isn't really about what Aristotle and Aquinas thought. He's really interested in some of the old medical textbooks that he's had a chance to look at. And he has a whole bunch of fantastic illustrations in his book to show how, up until, again, about 1700, this exaggerated effort is undertaken by the illustrators for these textbooks to make the male and female reproductive organs look really, really similar. Then, after around 1700, they start to look more different. Now, why would illustrators do this? Well, Lacour has a bunch of explanations, but really, on his view, it's part of an attitude towards the universe that wasn't really possible after, the colonization of the world and industrialization and the printing press and all of that stuff that, rocked the world around 1700. Before that time, he says, thinkers had this view that the universe was harmonic, right? It had beautiful patterns that reproduced themselves. There was kind of this aesthetic appreciation of the universe and a sense that things should really match nicely, right? I'm really oversimplifying his view here, but that's the kind of explanation he uses. And so we'll just go through these quickly. This is a 1538 illustration of female genitalia on the left and male on the right, intended to illustrate the similarities between them. Interestingly, up until about the mid-17th century, All of the illustrations of the female genitalia added horns here. Maybe that goes back to the monster issue. I don't know. What's really interesting in this illustration, though, is if you look down here, and I'll show you a better image soon enough, the vagina looks very similar to the penis here, right? And in fact, that becomes a running gag throughout, throughout medical textbooks in the period. Here, you think, oh, what a nice penis and pair of testicles. But in fact, this illustration from 1575 is an illustration. They're both of female reproductive organs, only in the one on the right, the front has been cut away to reveal the contents of the uterus. But notice, at a glance, nobody would look at this and say, whoa, female, right? And so just so you understand what's going on here, you want to sort of put the tops of the legs here. And so the idea is that all we see of the female penile structure is the very tip, right? And the opening of the female penile structure is just bigger than the male penis. But otherwise, our kind of, I'll stop using finger quotes at some point. It just takes a while to get used to, right? The rest of our kind of penis is interior, up inside our bodies. So that's going to be happening right about there, right? And here, another illustration, two of them, in fact, of vaginas. Obviously a vagina. Look at it. What else could it be, right? Where there are some clear resemblances to the penis, right? So we've got some theological, some metaphysical, and some biological evidence that there really was historically an attempt to shoehorn the two sexes into something like a one-sex model. So we're going to skip the two-sex model because, just ask someone, they'll tell you. We're going to skip ahead to the three-sex models. Now, there are actually some fairly recent candidates from anthropology that we might want to consider. I'm not sure that these are good instances, but I thought they were interesting, and you can sort of produce your own views about them. So there's certainly documentation in Inuit literature and in anthropologist interviews with Inuit elders of an Inuit notion of a third gender. I don't want to cheat, though. We've been talking about sex all night, and I include it for your interest, right? I should say quickly that the Inuit third gender is often a shaman figure. The Inuit third gender members of that third gender are so-called, they're called members of the third gender because they adopt opposite gender roles and clothing from their own gender. By gender roles, that might mean that they're hunting rather than scraping skins, or vice versa. It's not clear to me, though, that the Inuit have anything like a third sex. It looks pretty clear to me from what I've seen so far, and I'm not an anthropologist. It looks pretty clear to me that the Inuit had a pretty strong sense that there were two sexes, but that there was some fluidity in terms of gender. There was no necessity of a particular gender attaching to a particular sex. But I don't think that that's going to count as evidence of a third sex for us tonight. Possibly counting as evidence is the phenomenon of the hijras of India and Pakistan, who they're sometimes described as eunuchs, but this obviously does a disservice to, this person. It's not enough to describe her as a eunuch. And it's interesting that hijras, people always use the pronouns she and her for them. There's no confusion about this at all. So this person was born biologically a male, and at some point in early adulthood had some kind of surgical change to her genitalia to make her biologically female. The interesting and to me kind of horrifying thing is that a lot of hijra from the research I've seen have the older hijras perform this surgery on the younger ones, and they're not medical doctors or anything. And there are some gruesome details out there about how the surgery is done, but the interesting thing is that individuals choose to be hijras. There's lots and lots of evidence of individuals at age 18, young boys at 18, seeking out the hijras and seeking out this procedure and then joining the community. Now, they occupy this really strange space in Indian culture where they're considered taboo and they're really ostracized. On the other hand, it's good luck to have them at weddings. What else do I want to say about the hijras? They're not allowed to perform sex trade work. It's against the law, but that tends to be what they do for a living. And in fact, there's increasing evidence out there that one sort of economic function that the hijras serve, if I may call it that, is to provide a seemingly heterosexual outlet for men with homosexual tendencies. But that's neither here nor there. Here I've got a quote from Famila, this hijra here. Though hijras have existed for so long, the law speaks about only two genders. Now, I give you this quote because I think the implication, these are in her own words, the implication is that she doesn't consider herself to be female either. Two genders doesn't seem to be enough to capture the hijra in a taxonomy, according to this woman. Are they a third sex? Well, they have biological differences from biological males, and so if we're willing to count a surgical transformation as sufficient to create a third sex, then they would count as a third sex. You can make the rules on that one. If you're not going to accept surgical intervention as third sex producing, then they're just a way more radical instance of the third gender that we find with Inuit. Here's another three-sex model. I don't know if you'll be able to see this very well. It's hard to find pictures of this online. I didn't have time to draw anything. And some of my students are here. I actually tried to draw something to explain this in class on the blackboard. And was it the most traumatic drawing of all time? Are you sleeping at night? Are you still having the nightmares? So in a Platonic dialogue called The Symposium, which is such a great read. Plato writes this little play where he has all the movers and shakers of ancient Athens get together at basically a drinking party, and they decide that they're going to go around the table, and each of them is going to give an account of what love is. And we get to Aristophanes, and I should be clear, I've said here this is Aristophanes in Plato's Symposium. There's no evidence that Aristophanes himself ever told the story, and in fact, there was really no love lost between Aristophanes and Plato. So there's good reason that Plato told this story just as satire, in a way to take the Mickey out of Aristophanes. So I'm not offering this myth because I want to claim that anybody ever believed it. I'm offering it again to explore what it is possible to think, to give evidence it's possible to think of a third sex. Here's the third sex that Aristophanes in the Symposium thinks of. He tells us that back in the old days, there were three sexes, not just the two that we have now. And that people were quite a bit different from what they are nowadays, because everybody had 4 arms and 4 legs and 2 faces, peering in opposite directions, right? So you have to imagine 2 people back to back, right? The kind of these octopus people. And there were, they say, there were 3 sexes. There were the people of the sun, who were the equivalent of 2 men glued on back to back. People of the earth, which were like 2 women glued on back to back. And then the people of the moon, which were kind of the oddball of the bunch. They're a man and a woman kind of stuck together, right? Well, these people, because they had so many arms and legs and eyes and things, became incredibly powerful. And they started to threaten the autonomy of the gods. And so the gods all got together and said, what are we going to do about these powerful people? And Zeus says, well, I'll use some lightning bolts and split them all in 2. And if they only have 2 legs and 2 arms and 2 sets of eyes each, they're going to be no trouble for us at all. So this is kind of, I really want to show you, there's this lovely little French short film online, beautifully little illustrated film with a beautiful French accent. I felt very posh even listening to it. And that illustrates this myth. And here's a still from that film where Zeus, in this case he isn't using a thunderbolt, he seems to be using dental floss, is cutting 2 of these people in half. Right? And according to the story, the people, were obviously distressed and in pain, and they were scattered to all the corners of the earth. But the gods took pity upon them and gave them a way to seek a little bit of comfort. And this was through the invention of love, right? The gods created love so that each half that remained could seek out its opposite half and in the act of lovemaking achieve a kind of temporary unity. They would never be as powerful as they were before they were divided, but there was a little bit of solace to be had from making love with one's other half. But notice what this means. On the Aristophanes view, there are a couple of options in terms of sex partners. This isn't assuming any kind of heterosexual norm. The three sexes, right, are, if you want to know what sex you are, you look at two things. You look at your anatomy, and you look at who you're attracted to as your other half. So if I were attracted to another woman, I would know, I am earth sex, right? If I were attracted to a man, I would know that I was moon sex, and likewise for men. They'd have to ask both those questions to figure out what sex they were. We find something kind of similar, and this is no longer just a parodic tale in a little play. I don't want to call the symposium a little play. Erase that. It's much more important than that. But in 19th century sexology, in the early days of sexology, a German sexual researcher, or sex researcher, Karl Ulrichs, in his Inclusa in 1864, actually argued that there are three sexes. Why did he argue this? Well, he was trying to find an explanation for homosexuality. Why did he think he needed an explanation? Well, because he was, I should say that he was gay himself and was an important, historically important gay activist. But he just took it as unquestionably true that sexual attraction is always to the opposite sex, and yet he knew that he was attracted to men. He knew that there were other people who were attracted to their own sex, so he needed some kind of explanation for this. And he eventually came to the view that there were, in fact, three sexes. Now, they're not the same as Aristophanes' three sexes. Ulrichs talks about Dionian males. We don't have to get into what the Dionian means, except that for our purposes, it just means heterosexual, right? So there's heterosexual males, Dionian females, so heterosexual females, and then Uranians. And he lumped all Uranians, so all homosexual people, into the same category. On Ulrich's view, though, the Uranians weren't just these freaks who were attracted to their own sex. In fact, each of them had elements of the opposite sex inside them. So if I were a Uranian woman, I would have masculine elements in me, right? And this would explain my attraction to other women. It's the masculine element in me that's attracted to women because, of course, heterosexuality is normal on Ulrich's view, right? So again, it's quite a different model. But again, we have this model where to know what sex you are, in this case to know whether you're a Dionian or a Uranian, right, you need to know not only what your anatomy is like, but what your sexual orientation is. You calculate those in together, and that tells you what sex you are, right? So this really intricate diagram works for both Ulrichs and Aristophanes, even though their views were different in some ways. So clearly, folks have given some thought to a three-sex model and have taken it seriously. It is possible to think it. There is also a five-sex model. We'll be here all night. Wait till we get to the 28-sex model. Whoa. Oh, I skipped ahead. I'm not good at wheels. Here we go. So here's the five-sex model, brought to us by actually a biologist at Brown University, Anne Fausto Sterling. She actually works on flatworms. So those little guys with the penises are part of her inspiration. I'm sorry that I put my penis in my mouth, but there it is. Life goes on. Let the healing begin. These are the five sexes she proposes, female and male, clearly, right? But she also proposes that we recognize firm, herm, and merm, which are her short forms for female pseudohermaphrodite, true hermaphrodite, and male pseudohermaphrodite. Now, she's not at all interesting as a biologist in recognizing the existence of female pseudohermaphrodites and true hermaphrodites and male pseudohermaphrodites, and she's merely cute for coming up with firm, herm, and merm. What makes her interesting is the claim that we want to take these people who really exist, right? There really are a whole bunch of people who exemplify these conditions, and not just leave them out of our taxonomy, but in fact expand the taxonomy to recognize their existence, right? So here are some of the details. Female pseudohermaphrodites have ambiguous genitalia but 2 ovaries. That's why they get to be called female pseudohermaphrodites. They sometimes, but don't necessarily, have a uterus. They have 2 X chromosomes. I made it seem like they get 4 chromosomes there. So they either have 2 chromosomes or they have XX chromosomes. You choose. Sorry. And without medical intervention at puberty, they can sometimes develop beards, deep voices, and adult-sized penises. In terms of the ambiguous genitalia, the term that often gets used is micropenis. And there's a whole literature out there about how you tell a micropenis from a clitoris and what the exact cutoff point is. No pun intended. We'll talk about that. Serious. The merms, the male pseudohermaphrodites, also have ambiguous genitalia, but predictably enough, they have 2 testes, have a vagina and a clitoris, XY chromosomes. And so it's kind of a mirror image. They sometimes develop breasts at puberty, but they don't menstruate. And then the true hermaphrodite, as they're called, has ambiguous genitalia, 1 testis and 1 ovary. And I don't know whether this is right, but Fausto Sterling is a biologist and I'm not. Fausto Sterling argues it's at least in principle possible for a true hermaphrodite to be both father and mother of their own child. Now, she doesn't claim it's ever happened or that it's a good idea. There's a whole bunch of incest taboos there. But she says it's at least possible for such a thing to happen. There's a whole range of possible anatomical instantiations. So they can present as very male or female or very mixed. It can really go all over the place. Sometimes they menstruate. And in fact, Fausto Sterling even cites some ancient legal documents that have prescriptions for, what hermaphrodites should do when they're menstruating. They have to leave the community of men with the women when it's time for them to menstruate and so forth. They're usually XX chromosomal, but not always. That varies. True hermaphrodites there's a whole range of possibilities out there. Here's how Fausto Sterling describes the situation facing hermaphrodites. And she says hermaphrodite early on and then talks about intersex later on. Intersex is a term that's used way more often than hermaphrodite now, but she's using them as more or less equivalent here. Hermaphrodites have unruly bodies, she writes. They do not fall naturally into a binary classification. That's what's interesting to us, obviously. Only a surgical shoehorn can put them there. Now, they're not using a shoehorn where they should use a scalpel. They're using scalpels, sorry. But what she has in mind here is the fact that at least up until very recently, the norm in terms of case management for intersexed infants was to surgically alter the infant as soon as possible. The view was that for a person to grow up and be actualized and happy, they have to be one sex or the other. So the most humane thing to do is to correct the error. And I use scare quotes because there are now intersex people who say, hey, I'm not an error. I'm just part of the great tapestry that is life. I'm a beautiful part of the variety of the universe, right? But this isn't the surgical attitude. The surgical attitude is to regard the intersex person as suffering from a pathology and to correct the error surgically as soon as possible so that the child can grow up as one sex or another, right? So that's the surgical shoehorn she's talking about. A colleague of mine who works on intersex has drawn my attention to the fact that this is happening less and less now. Because increasingly it's the case that people abort their fetuses when they find out that they're going to be intersex. This is considered a birth defect worthy of aborting the fetus, even for people who are trying to have a baby. So there are fewer surgical alterations now because fewer intersex babies are born. But why should we care if a woman if a woman defined as one who has breasts, a vagina, a uterus, and ovaries, and who menstruates, also has a clitoris large enough to penetrate the vagina of another woman. Why should we care if there are people whose biological equipment enables them to have sex naturally with both men and women? The answers seem to lie in a cultural need to maintain clear distinctions between the sexes. Society mandates the control of intersexual bodies because they blur and bridge the great divide. So that's her word on that. I want to talk a little bit more about some of the issues with intersex. Who's heard of John Money before? Well, I have. Sorry, I lied. John Money is a researcher, a psychologist who died just a couple of years ago, and really he wrote the book, a whole bunch of them, in fact, on case management of intersex infants. He also became the expert on transsexuals, at least in terms of psychology and surgical issues. Throughout the second half of the 20th century, you couldn't think about intersex or transsex issues without encountering John Money at some point. He is really the guy responsible for this treatment regimen that says, okay, as soon as a baby with ambiguous genitalia is born, you got to get in there, you got to make a call, here's how you make the call, and you got to perform the procedure right away, right? Among the other things he says is that the only way that the sex of the child, the new sex or the true sex, whatever it turns out to be, is going to take is if the parents believe it too. So he, in fact, gives advice. He never says to surgeons, lie to parents, but he does say, there are ways that you can sort of massage the truth so that it's an easier decision for the parents and they don't have to wrestle with the decision of what to do with their intersexed infant, and so that at the end of the day, they themselves believe that the baby was a girl all along or was a boy all along, right? So there's this whole little subterfuge necessary to convince everybody, the patient and the parents, as soon as possible, right, that there was never any question about the sex. And so the norm in meetings between surgeons and parents for years was for surgeons to say, when a child was born with a micropenis or an enlarged clitoris, it's anybody's guess what it is with a newborn. The norm was for doctors to say things like, the clitoris is just a little on the big side. It's just like the baby being born with earlobes that are a little big. It's nothing serious. We're just going to do a little nip and tuck now so that there's no confusion. It'll be easier for everybody in the end, right? Now, the little nip and tuck, or whatever the surgery was, whichever way the surgeons decide to go, turns out to be, a medically invasive procedure, which, not so much in Canada, but in the States where Money was operating is, very expensive for the patient's family, right? There's good evidence that parents weren't being allowed to give informed consent because they were getting the sort of massaged white lie version of the truth. And there was never an opportunity for the intersex persons themselves to ever weigh in on what they felt like or how they wanted to be, right? What's really a puzzling paradox with Money is that on the one hand, he seems so doggedly committed to the two-sex model, right? If somebody isn't clearly male or female, then they're broken and we got to fix them right away because, oh my God, the trauma of occupying a gray space between male and female, right? I mean, he seems doggedly committed to the two-sex model. On the other hand, he seems to regard sex and gender as really fluid. He has this view that comes out both in his prescriptions for intersexed infants, but also in his writings on transsexuals, that really if you do the right things, if you take the right steps, anybody can become any sex and live happily ever after. There won't be any identity issues. So it's this really odd thing that he's so dogmatic about sex and yet seems to have this sort of hippie, free love kind of, oh, sure, he can become a man kind of attitude, right? We see this perhaps, remember when I said I'd do violence to subtlety here and there? I don't know if you noticed that I just did that. But he's written lots of stuff so he can defend himself. You can look it up. Money's the danger of Money's view became really apparent in the public eye with the case of David Raymer, who's actually a boy from Manitoba who was born male. Nothing ambiguous about his genitalia, but there was an error made in his circumcision, and his penis was inadvertently amputated when he was a newborn. What did the parents do? What did the attending physicians do? Exactly what anybody else would have done at the time. They called Money in, because Money is the guy who deals with unusual genitalia in infants. He hadn't been born with unusual genitalia, but he sure had unusual genitalia after the circumcision, right? And again, Money took this view that sex identity is very, very fluid, right? And he said, okay, so there's no way that a man can ever be happy and actualized without a penis. Men just need penises to be full men, right? So since he's never going to make it as a man, we got to make him a girl now so that he can grow up at least to be a happy woman. So they amputated David's testicles and created this kind of web of lies within the community. And again, not because the parents were bad people or not because Money was a bad person, just because there was this view that if everybody believed that David had actually been born Brenda, so there he is as Brenda, then there'd be no problem with his development of a healthy female gender identity, right? And so, when Brenda hit puberty, she had to be given hormonal treatment because she wasn't a girl, right? But quite famously, Raymer became incredibly depressed and suicidal and never, ever really adopted the female identity and eventually figured out what had happened. The sad end to the story is that even after David transitioned back to male, he remained incredibly acutely depressed and ended up committing suicide. When he died, this just hit the media like you wouldn't believe, and suddenly everybody had heard of John Money, and this cast a real pall over Money's reputation for the rest of his career. So I mention this not only because there's a Canadian connection and there's some evidence here about what we can and can't change in terms of sex, but also to show that there really are genuine risks involved in too binary a conception of sex, right? This idea at the time that there's no way a man can be happy without a penis. He's not really a man at all, and there's no middle space that he could possibly carve out some happiness in, right, was what led to raising David as a really, really unhappy Brenda. So there are some serious moral issues at play when we shoehorn people into one sex or the other, right? And I take it that even though David wasn't intersexed, the same kinds of moral issues are clearly at play in terms of the case management of intersexed infants, right? Just so you know how many people actually are intersexed, about 4% of the population is intersex. It's hard to tell because it's not readily documented. Not everybody gets diagnosed, right? Some genitalia is more ambiguous than others. I was just reading tonight, I was Googling, right, and I was reading this first-person account by a grown man who had just found out that he was intersex. All his life, he just thought that he had a really small penis. And he was relieved, right? It's amazing how relieved he was. You see this tone in the entries on this blog he's writing. He's like, suddenly, he's got a place in the world. He's not just a failure at the masculine contest, right? But in any case, he wouldn't be in the statistics because somebody at some point just didn't notice. And this is the thing. Mostly we're not delivered by specialists. Mostly we're delivered by, or at least not specialists in intersex, right? We're delivered by GPs and obstetricians and midwives who aren't really trained to take a close look and deal with those ambiguities. And God knows first-time parents, unless it's something that leaps right out at you, you just assume, oh, I had no idea babies were weird in this way, right? So a lot of intersex goes undiagnosed, right? So we've looked now at the 1, 3, and 5 sex model. Are are there any other models that we should be considering? Well, there are a few, and again, these are more in the category of thinking the possible than actual empirical evidence here. So we've talked about Shula Smith Firestone already. Remember, she had the hippie hair. So she talks about, right, I'd said that she talks about male and female as this really fundamental biological divide. But she doesn't want things to stay that way. She wouldn't be an interesting hippie feminist if she wanted things to stay that way. She says the great thing now, though, is technology frees us from the constraints that led to this kind of division. Right? So she says there were lots of things that kept women down over the years, right? The fact that it takes so long to gestate an infant, that human infants are so helpless for so long, that, you can't run when you're massively pregnant, and there are predators and so forth. There were a whole bunch of things involved with reproduction that made females the weaker sex, right? And she's writing this, in the early 70s, late 60s, in there. You saw the hair. And has this great optimism of what technology will do for us, right? She has this idea of this utopia afforded by technology where a reproduction will become detached from individual human females, right? So, I don't know, some kind of baby pod factory or something, and children will be raised together by communities. There'll be no need for, the mom to stay at home for any length of time. This is going to free us from our shackles as women, right? That we no longer have to bear and raise children. But she thinks this is going to make society so much better, because she says you've got all these nasty dualisms, all this nasty black and white thinking that comes out of this fundamental biological dualism. Once technology allows us to escape that biological dualism, then we can start to explore the gray areas in the rest of life. And we're not any longer going to think it's okay for the rich to oppress the poor, or to even just to think of everything as an either-or problem, right? We're going to have to explore all these fruitful gray areas that our biological sex convinced us weren't there at all, right? So she has this great optimism about what's possible. She says that, sexually we're not going to have to be attracted to anybody at all, and certainly not just based on, what particular appendages they have, that she predicts a future of what she calls polymorphous perversity, where basically anything goes because all of the old categories have been rendered irrelevant by wonderful new technology, right? I think she meant around now. So you can notice whether that prediction worked out or not. There's a fantastic novel, a classic science fiction novel, and one of the earliest feminist science fiction novels by Ursula Le Guin called The Left Hand of Darkness. Here's the kind of radical vision that she has. She has a whole planet of people on this planet called Gethin or Gethane. I don't speak that kind of nerd. I speak other nerd dialects, where the residents of this planet are all what she calls sequential hermaphrodites. And so for 28 days out of every month, they're all these kind of neuter androgynes, right? But at the end of the month, they all kind of go into heat. And as you go into heat, that determines what your biological sex is going to be. For mating purposes, how does that get determined? Well, whoever you're kind of flirting with and attracted to, your pheromones are kind of going to battle it out and determine what sex you develop for the 2 days where you actually are sexed. After your mating period is over, you revert to being a neuter androgyne until the next mating opportunity arises. So there's this really fluid notion of sex, but again, it's biological sex, not gender, right? And here we have Fausto Sterling again, and a misspelling of optimistic, my apologies. Fausto Sterling's optimistic hope. Now, unlike Le Guin and Firestone, Fausto Sterling doesn't give us an elaborate setup, an elaborate sort of science fiction speculative setup about how this is going to come into play. But she kind of, I said optimistic here, maybe the word is actually, what was the word I wanted? Wistful, a kind of wistful hope that she has, right? She writes, but what if things were altogether different? This is after having written about some of the terrible problems engendered by invasive surgical procedures for intersex infants. But what if things were altogether different? Imagine a world in which the same knowledge that has enabled medicine to intervene in the management of intersexual patients has been placed at the service of multiple sexualities. Imagine that the sexes have multiplied beyond currently imaginable limits. A new ethic of medical treatment would arise, one that would permit ambiguity in a culture that had overcome sexual division. She doesn't give us any serious cause for optimism that's going to happen, and you can certainly detect some pessimism here and there in her writing, but that's her hope. I'm going to cheat again a little bit and move into gender very briefly instead of sex, because there's a similar kind of wistful hope that we get from Christine Overall, a Canadian philosopher, who's writing not about a sex-free future, but at least a gender-free future. But I think it's worth quoting because what she says about a gender-free future, it's reasonable to think, would also come about in a sex-free future. So she writes, within a gender-free culture, there would be no more women or men, or at least there would need not be. Any women or men who exist would exist by choice. You would get to decide if you wanted to be a woman or a man, right? Not by compulsion or construction. With the disappearance of women and men, there would develop the possibility that new kinds of persons might emerge. As well, perhaps a resistance toward hasty categorization and more emphasis on the specialness of individuals. Perhaps, indeed, we would not adhere so committedly to adult-child distinctions, to racial and racialized categories, or even to the supposedly self-evident human-non-human distinction. We might evince more interest in bonds, networks, friendships among individuals and beings who are now considered very different, as well as among those who seem similar. Now, I know what you're thinking. Sounds groovy, right? Sure it does, right? You want to put on some patchouli and light some incense and play the bongos. Yeah, it'd be great. It'd be great, right? But didn't we start by talking about what's real, not what would be nice in some, utopia, what's really true? And it's well and good to consider the advantages of different classificatory systems, right, and to imagine how perfect it would be without them or with different ones. Or consider the advantages of overthrowing altogether existing classificatory systems. But this doesn't get us around the question, is there a real fact of the matter? Right? At the end of the day, if you're on a lie detector, a kind of metaphysical lie detector that's not concerned with whether you believe you're telling the truth, but whether you actually are telling the truth, right? And you're asked how many sexes there are, what do you actually say? Right? Oh gosh, I'm tangled up in wires. I don't know if I warned you that there'd be a cowardly cop-out. So we're going to... Wouldn't it be great if all of these schmoes had just completely neglected the solution, and here I could give it to you. I can sort of sketch some lines of what I think are going to be involved in this solution, but sadly I haven't myself solved the problem. When I do, I'll get tenure. So I want to say that sure, there are real facts of the matter, not maybe a fact of the matter, but that there are real facts that are relevant to the question, right? Notice that the whole silly thing with the horses, right? Whether there is a horse, the idea of a horse, horseness itself, right? The universal that connects all the other horses together, whether that's real or not, there are some true things we can say, at least about the individual horses down below, right? And so we might, similarly, in terms of the sexes, notice that there are true things we can say about chromosomes and anatomy and hormones and so forth, and about who has to mate with whom to reproduce. There are lots and lots of individual details that we can draw upon that are true facts. Right? Now, it's worth noting that these facts themselves, though, can get kind of sticky. Right? One instance of this is, again, this big debate in the literature over how you tell a clitoris from a micropenis, right? So I'd be happy to say, okay, whether there are men or not, we can at least agree that there are penises, right? But it turns out that there's some gray areas there, too. I mean, does this particular ambiguous genital count as a micropenis or a clitoris? There are some still difficult cases along the margins, but that doesn't mean that there's nothing true in the world that we can say, right? it's, oh, I'm so bad with, oh man, you should see me with a chalkboard. Oh, I'm just drawing and writing all over the place. It's fantastic. The thing is, even though there are facts of the matter, the problem is the facts themselves aren't enough on their own to give us our classificatory system, right? If they were, there would never have been any doubt about the classificatory system. The reason that doctors in 1530 were inclined to see female genitalia as very different from today's isn't that female genitalia changed in 1700. The fact of the matter was the same all along. It's because their seeing of it changed, right? Their interpretation of it changed. And our classificatory systems, even if they're grounded in some kind of reality, right, they don't just pop out of that reality. They emerge from the thing that we are classifying, but also from our act of classification. The facts on their own aren't going to do it. As I see it, we have two choices. We can keep the current classificatory system and either shoehorn marginal cases into it or exclude them from it, right? So we can say, yeah, there are men and women, and anybody who doesn't qualify, well, he's kind of male-ish. We'll call him a man. Welcome, you're a man, right? Or just say, well, some people are neither male nor female. There are a few statistical outliers. That's just the way it is with large populations. And it looks like I'm making fun of it, but I'm not actually making fun of that view. That's one way to go about dealing with messy outliers with a classificatory system, right? The other option I see is to adapt the current classificatory system. Right? There's actually a third option. You can just abandon the classification of things altogether. I'm a realist. In that nominalist-realist debate, it's going to sound like I'm not because I'm trying to persuade you about a whole bunch of crazy unrealistic possibilities, in some sense of unrealistic. But I actually think that we need general concepts, right? And that we can say true things with them and about them, right? So I don't want to abandon classificatory systems altogether. I actually think we'd have real serious problems with language and thought if we gave up our classificatory systems, right? You don't get to just give up the one. As soon as you have a principled reason for abandoning one taxonomy, then all of the other taxonomies stand or fall by the same sword, right? So here's the first option, right? Keeping the system as it currently is. So just male and female, right? The advantages of that, right, is that the current system comports with most of our habitual common sense ideas about sex. Presumably, I would hope that everybody in the room is thinking that right now, right? I mean, this is pretty straightforward. We have these common sense ideas about sex, and our system currently deals with them pretty well, right? But in response to that, I would say, but we have seen that there are other possible ideas. They're not habitual yet, right? But the interesting thing about habits is that they're acquired. Right? Just because one system of seeing the world is habitual now doesn't mean that it's inevitable, right? So surely if we were to go about acquiring new ideas, there'd be a bumpy, difficult patch. You know what it's like I've never done this, but what I can imagine it's like when you go to England and rent a car and have to remember to drive on the left-hand side of the road, right? It's not insuperable, though, but it's awkward. You have to get into the habit, right? The current system is handy. It sure is, right? But I hope that I've shown you that it's not handy for the people who are marginalized or disadvantaged by it. It's not handy for intersex people who have radical invasive surgeries that actually affect their well-being, right, as infants, because we're such binaristic thinkers about sex, right? A pro of the system, the current system, is that it accords with biological fact. It accords with some of the biological facts, absolutely, right? For some people, it's just uncomplicatedly true that they're male or female. Absolutely, right? But my response would be to say that it only accords with some of the biological facts and ignores others. And I'm ambitious enough a realist to want a taxonomy that doesn't leave out a whole bunch of outliers. So it's not that I'm sloppy about my taxonomies and want to lower the standard. I want to raise the standard and do a better job of sorting things. Okay? So obviously, it's clear where my bias is. I think we should adapt the system, right? This is where I give you the cowardly cop-out. I don't quite know how. So if any of you knows how, let me know, and we'll publish it together. And then, like I say, I'll get tenure. And I'll put a little footnote in and thank you. These are the two options that I've been working with so far. Right? It seems to me that both of them have some possibilities. Maybe they could be combined. Maybe either on its own would be enough. Right? So here's what I call the pragmatic adaptation of the system. In the pragmatic adaptation, we adopt different classifications for different contexts and applications. Right? So whenever somebody asks, are you male or female, the correct response, unless the context makes it straightforward, and unless you're just, so male that there can be no doubt, or so female that there can be no doubt, the correct response is to say, well, in what respect? Why are we asking now? Right? So it might be that the question gets answered differently for the purposes of which public washroom a person uses than it does in terms of what kinds of heart pills somebody needs to take in old age. Right? It turns out that the answers to those two questions might be very different. Right? And clearly we want our classificatory systems to serve us well. Right? So one way is to have, like I say, a pragmatic recognition that we're going to need one system for bathrooms and one system for heart pills. Maybe. Right? The second option, and I think I've put it badly here, let me know if you come up with a better way to put it, but it's to try to reconceive sex as something qualitative rather than quantitative. What do I mean by that? It sounds odd because I don't think any of us are aware of thinking about sex as quantitative, but this is what I mean by the distinction. If I were to send you into a room to sort things, right, there are kind of two ways that I could do it, right? I could say, okay, go into the children's library. Don't tell them what we've been talking about. But go into the children's library and find all the furniture with 4 legs, right? Or, in fact, find all 4-legged things. If there's a cat there, throw it in. I don't care, right? And you could easily sort, you count, find all the 4-legged things and put them together, right? You've satisfied the instruction, right? Or I could say, okay, go into the children's library and find all the blue things. Now, the interesting thing in the blue things is going to be a harder test, isn't it? Because you're going to find there are some children's books in there, the color of whom, on the cover, is, you can't tell really whether it's blue or purple. It's really, really borderline. It's not clear whether it's blue or teal. It's so close. Right? What you might have to do in that situation is ask other people their views. Maybe you want to take that book and contrast it with yellow books so you get a real sense of, what it looks like in different contexts. But I'll bet that if I sent all of you into the children's library and said to gather the 4-legged things, you'd come up with the very same things. And I'll bet that if I sent you in there to gather all of the blue things, you'd come up with slightly different sets. I think a whole bunch of the things that you gathered in the blue category would be very much the same. Right? You'd gather a whole bunch of the same ones, but you'd have different ways of handling the statistical outliers. Right? And you wouldn't necessarily be wrong, right? But at least you'd have to discuss the outliers, right? And you wouldn't just sweep them under the carpet. You'd be conscious of the category of blue in a thoughtful new way that you hadn't been before. And I guess I want to suggest that there's some reason to think that sex might be that kind of category, where if I say, sorry, not into the children's room because that would be bad. But go look at these biological specimens over here, right? These cadavers or whatever. Inspect them all you like and separate the males from the females, right? It might just be that sorting process turns out to operate very much like the blue sorting process, the qualitative one, and not the leg counting sorting process, the quantitative one. That's not to say there's not a fact of the matter, right? I can claim truly and convincingly that there are blue things in the world, yet still recognizing that there are some difficult border territories that we have to think hard about and take seriously and not do violence to. Right? We would never, with the blue books, go and say, I can't tell what's blue or purple. Somebody grab me a paintbrush. Right? I'm going to paint it blue because nothing can exist in the netherworld between blue and purple. Right? So all I want to suggest is that we take this qualitative approach to sex, we might accord human beings as much dignity and care as we accord blue books in the children's library. We wouldn't just suddenly want to grab a scalpel because we weren't sure. Okay? I suspect that some of you think, right, that these are attractive ideas, but some of you think that this is just crazy. These are pseudo-problems. And the fact is that male and female sexes are fundamental. Of course, you should think that that's to be expected, right? All I can say to that is that we are, again, habituated to this older taxonomy, and that changing the taxonomy, if we're going to do it at all, will take some imagination. This is, I take it, the point of this little bit of doggerel from Samuel Hoffenstein. Lives there a man with hide so tough to say two sexes aren't enough? It's interesting that Hoffenstein, who seems to me in this question to embody both an admirable curiosity about gray areas, but also a reluctance to leave the black and white behind, was the screenwriter for a number of classic films, including The Wizard of Oz. Right? So I take it that the same tug of war we find that little question from him is a tug of war that we find in the film and in the main protagonist, right? Between the desire to follow the yellow brick road and the homely, safer urge and not to leave behind the familiar. So, in fact, the intuition that there is no place like the two-sex home. That's it. Thanks. Thank you. Do you have any questions? You're welcome to have questions, but you don't have to. Khan. I won't know everybody's name.
First, I have a question about the beginning of your presentation about realism and real. So, like, according to the definition, what you said is like more material stuff. Like, I can look at her and say, okay, it's a human being. But do they not include emotions or feelings in the definition? Like, for example, I can say, that's my imagination of a horse, but then what does a horse think of itself?
What does a horse think of itself? I think that's a fantastic question because...
Not like what a horse thinks of itself, but like...
I'm just guessing. I'm not a horse. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, so like, maybe we have a view about somebody, and they have a view about themselves as somebody else. So how does that fit into realism, or how does that fit into the word real?
I don't think that's a metaphysical question. I think that's an ethical and an etiquette question, in fact. I think I mean, see, here's the thing. Last year, when Thomas Beattie, some of you will recall, was the first famous, there was a less famous one, but the first famous female-to-male transsexual to have a baby, right? We talked about this in my gender issues class, and I kept using the pronoun he, right, and him. And there were a couple people in the class who were just going insane. And eventually, I mean, they were squirming and emailing each other. They didn't think I knew, right? They were getting really agitated. And eventually they said, why are you calling her him, right? She was born a woman. She's pregnant. Why are you saying him? And my answer was, well, I don't have any principled metaphysical reason for it, but I think it's good manners to call people what they ask you to call them. Right? I mean, I think that the answer is an etiquette question, but I actually think, that seems like a superficial thing to say, but I think that some points of etiquette are motivated not just by mismanners, but by deeper ethical questions, right? And I actually think that, I mean, this is something I wanted to draw out in the discussion of intersexed infants, that it's important for the person whom you're talking about or whom you're operating on, whom you're classifying, to get some say, right? For them to be able to speak for themselves. Right? So I don't think that's metaphysical, although it might be more important than the metaphysical. It's ethical. Yeah.
I was just wondering if they take that into their consideration when they're talking about it.
So no, the medieval philosophers debating nominalism and realism, they're pretty far on the spectrum from the way I think about things, and they're not interested in what people think about themselves. I want to be clear, they weren't writing about sex at all, right? Well, they were writing about whether women would be men in the resurrection and stuff, but otherwise their issue wasn't with sex. They were thinking about how to do science, right? And for them, the answer to the question never lies in what you or I think. It lies in what God thinks and how God created the universe. These people, I mean, they were all committed theists whose philosophy was really just an outgrowth of their theism and their Aristotle. Right? So when God's telling you what to think, you don't have to ask yourself what you think. Right?
Very good.
Yes, Christine?
You're saying that Aristotle said that thought that females were a mistake. So the implication is that in a perfect world, just men. But how do you think that?
Okay, so I did some violence. If I said that Aristotle said females were a mistake, I did some violence to him. He says that females are incidental and deficient. Right? Sorry, I made it sound like he was. On his view, here's the kind of Aristotelian story. He looks at the various species of living things and says that some of them have their sexes together, right? Which is, it turns out, I mean, he's looking at plants and things, and it turns out that they do have male and female components, right? But he says, and he even looks at some animals who have both sets of sex organs, right? So I don't know whether he was looking at the flatworms or not. And notices that the lower creatures all have their sexes together, but the higher creatures on his, great chain of being separate the sexes. And his reasoning for why this is that the higher up you get on the great chain of being, in a way, this is going to get complicated. Let me see how simple I can keep it. In a way, the pattern needed to make that being becomes more complicated. You can't store it with the matter needed to make the being. So when I say pattern, those of you who know Aristotle know I mean form, right? So he feels that higher creatures need to separate form and matter into separate parts for reproductive purposes. I mean, he thought everybody had form and matter. But for reproductive purposes, the female does the job of the matter and the male does the job of the form, right? Because they kind of won't all fit in together. And with humans in particular, the idea is, and this is really developed by people like Augustine and Aquinas, that in a way, the male faculty of reason needs, in a way, to be off by itself away from female matter. So you have to separate the sexes out. So you need both sexes for reproduction with any kind of higher creature because you're getting into some wonderful formal areas and some wonderful rational capacities that just can't coexist with matter. That's completely oversimplified, but that's basically how the story goes. Oh, yay, thanks.
No, the interesting part about the decision of the doctor was that the doctor would decide and make the cuts without even checking on the x-ray if there were female parts inside or not.
Well, in fact, I mean, the protocol, I'm not sure what happened, in the early years of case management for intersex infants when they first started performing these procedures. The protocol in later years becomes this complicated business where this whole team of specialists is assembled. And so you do have internalists as well, and you do have people looking at chromosomal and hormonal information. The data seems to be, though, that whenever there was any tug of war about what to do between, say, the surgeon and the one of the other specialists, the surgeon seems to hold the day. And there's lots of speculation about why this is. At least one sociologist, Suzanne Kessler, who works quite a bit on this issue, takes the view that surgeons are just kind of the superstars of the medical world, and they're kind of the alpha wolves, right? And when in doubt, they're the ones who get to make the call, right? She also argues that there's a certain prestige for these medical teams to undertake these surgical interventions. It looks like, wow, this is really advanced medicine, right? So there are a whole bunch of kind of prestige incentives to, as you say, make the cut. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there have been some serious problems with these. Now, I don't think that they were ignoring or were ignorant of internal matters, but sometimes they neglected them. Absolutely. Yes, you had a question.
I was just wondering the same thing, whether parents are actually advised, that the child was born and the sex is kind of ambiguous, and whether there is a pressure from parents to perform that.
Whether pressures from parents?
Parents, because, I was wondering how I would act if I had a child, knowing how things run in my world, in my culture,
Well, I think, it's psychologists like Money wondering about how parents would act that largely motivates the case management, or used to motivate. I think it's changing a little bit very, very slowly at glacial pace, but used to motivate the case management of intersex infants. The worry was that if the parent ever worries that she made the wrong decision, or if the parents ever worry that they made the wrong decision, then they're going to kind of communicate that to the child, even just subconsciously or something. So the child is never going to feel secure in who he or she is, right? And so precisely because they were worried about the parent's reaction, people like Money argued that you can't allow the parent to be in a position where they feel like they have to struggle with a decision. So it was never the case, right, that the surgical teams were advised to sit down with the parents and say, now your child is intersex. Here are all the facts and options, right? They never used words like intersex or hermaphrodite, right? The surgical team in advance usually would decide whether they were calling the organ in question a micropenis or a clitoris, right? So they would never say to the parents, well, we're not sure whether the baby has a micropenis or a clitoris. The team would decide first. And then they would approach the parents and say, now, your little boy is healthy. He's a healthy little boy, but he has a smaller than average penis, right? Now, it's no big deal. It's just a small little oddity, and there's lots of stuff we can do for it, right? So the parents never, ever have to worry about whether they made a boy a girl or a girl a boy or whatever. Right? So the parents were never really given the option to struggle with the matter that you say you would struggle with. And I think it would be a struggle, right? I think the psychologists were absolutely right. If when my daughter was born, had I been told, that, straight out that she was intersex, she had ambiguous genitalia, here's the thing, I know what I would do now. But I don't know what I would have done 11 years ago when she was born. I think it would have been a huge, huge struggle for me to try to figure out what to do. I have a big struggle deciding what to do about just minor medical procedures. And this one's huge and affects the child's identity for the rest of his or her life, right? So in a way, they were trying to spare the parents that in the hopes that it would make a happier home and a happier child. They were trying to be humane. Yes?
What the statistics are on the parents, that number of parents that wait and let the child, reach puberty or something, and basically let the child come out?
I don't know what the statistics are. It hasn't been well recorded. There's lots of anecdotal evidence, and we know that trends are changing, but again, pretty slowly. The trend, it used to be that the only people who let intersex children grow up as intersexed people were those who were too poor to afford an alternative or who didn't have medical care. So there are lots of cases of people who've grown to adulthood as intersexed people in developing countries or who are living in the United States without health care or without health insurance, right? So in some cases, they wouldn't even know that their child was intersex, and in others, they couldn't have afforded the surgery. So that demographic's always been there. But then again, that demographic isn't recorded in the data because they're the ones who aren't getting diagnosed, right? In terms of those who could afford the medical intervention, up until recently, just everybody. It was just staggering the degree to which parents they didn't, in a way, they weren't given a choice. They were told the clitoris is over large. Here's what we're going to do to make it normal. And everybody wants their baby to be normal, right? So they all did it, right? Now there are kind of three options. Again, the main one, or increasingly, the option is to terminate the pregnancy. some very progressive doctors and healthcare professionals now, combined with some very progressive parents, are leading to an increase in people who are actually going through their childhood intersex. But it's too soon to have any numbers. This is really, really recent development. Yes?
Okay, so you were saying that chromosomally, the hermaphrodites they were talking about were usually XX? Because I know you're not a geneticist or anything, but
thank God, yeah.
There's XXY babies, there's XO babies,
yep.
There's a lot of different variations. So you're saying that chromosomally sexually these hermaphrodites were just average XX.
On the whole, but again, that was a generalization. I didn't say they're always XX. And when I talked about the wide range of differences among true hermaphrodites, there's a whole lot of differences in terms of their chromosomal makeup as well. And then a different kind of hermaphroditism arises out of the different chromosomal makeup. I can hardly say more than that without sounding like a kindergarten student because I just am not a scientist. Right? But yeah, there's a range there, but they're still predominantly XX. As among the true hermaphrodites, by the way, right? With the male pseudohermaphrodites, they're XY, and the female pseudohermaphrodites, they're XX. Right. Yes, ma'am.
I just can't help but ask. I've been filling out a lot of surveys and applications lately, and they all ask me whether I'm male or female. And I was just wondering what you would hope to see instead.
I'm glad you asked. I am doing a study right now in a completely unrelated area. It's a study on philosophical pedagogy. It involves a survey. And I went to the length of changing the gender portion of the demographic survey to a from a multiple choice to a fill in the blank. So I thought male, female, other. With a bunch of 20-year-olds, they're just going to choose other just to be dickish, right? Other? Take that, professor, right? And so my apologies to 20-year-olds in the room. I say this because that's what I would have done. Hell, I'd probably do it now, right? But on my survey it says sex, then a line. And people can write down what they want to. It's good manners.
Yeah, I would write author too.
Would you? It's not just the 20-year-olds. Con.
I was just wondering if the way overall says if you get rid of gender, so then you will have like no boxes saying like you made a female. So if we actually just say do get rid of gender notions, isn't that going to solve like the whole base problem?
Wouldn't it solve the problem?
Yeah, wouldn't that like solve the problem?
Well, it solves the problem of how to construct surveys that way, right? And it solves the problem of how many bathrooms to offer in public places. But again, there might be problems with heart pills, right? I think that the taxonomies seem to be useful for some things, right? And sometimes people want to reproduce, and the taxonomy is useful that way, right? In the sort of sexless future that Overall and Firestone envision, it might be luck of the draw whether you chose the right kind of partner to reproduce. But they don't suggest that people are going to become blind, right? But I mean, in a way, we need to recognize certain of those facts of the matter that are out there for practical reasons. There are practical considerations at play. But yeah, we can be very inclusive about other things that are less pressing, like again, survey construction and bathroom doors. Christine.
Do you know what point of gestation you can tell whether it's the fetus is intersex or not?
That's a fantastic question. I'm embarrassed that I don't know the answer. I mean, I know that fetuses' sexual differentiation occurs later on. Obviously, it does. Does anybody here assign? Does anybody know at what week sexual differentiation occurs?
I just wondered how hard the decision. I mean, for me, the decision may be.
It'd be harder in third trimester than in first, or something.
And if it was something that didn't come out until,
Well, it's not a first trimester decision, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm thinking the end of the second trimester or something, but I can't believe I've never looked this up. Thank you. I'm gonna. Yay! I'll look it up tomorrow. You guys can all Google it. Yeah, Frank.
Quick comment. A cousin of mine recently had a baby about 3 weeks ago now, and for the very first time in the small town, Menton, Ontario, they were asked whether they would like pink, blue, or white baby bonnet.
Oh, isn't that nice? And you said baby bottle?
No, bonnet.
Oh, bonnet. Oh, isn't that nice?
Pink, blue, or white. They chose white.
I'm going to keep marching against the bastions until they give us Paisley, man. You know. That's fantastic. That's good.
Okay, I think we've come to the conclusion of tonight. Thank you, Shannon. That was really fascinating. Really fun.
Thanks. Good. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.